Welcome to the State of the Nation. I'm your host, Mike Sham. On the State of the Nation, we cover politics, but we also cover economics because, as I've said before, countries exist in only two states. People forget about this. You exist only in a state of war or a state of peace. When you're in war, you run a wartime economy. It's all pretty simple. Everything is framed towards stopping the enemy. It's a simple economy to run. You don't care about growth. You don't care about this. You only care about your armaments factories and hopefully people not dying of starvation. You don't really have to do the nuances. You only have to worry about one train line, and that's the one that goes to the front. You don't have to worry about people's wants and desires. Education takes a backseat. Everything disappears. In a state of peace, the country exists only to serve its economy. And in South Africa, we forget this basic lesson every time by thinking that economics is the same as a war. It's not. It's got many faces. Some people love Marmite and some people hate Marmite. The market will decide what to provide for people. And that's why economics is so important. And that's why South Africa has been so bad at economics, because we keep on hearing war this, war that, and they run it as if it's a simple answer. It's not. It's quite complex. So to help me unravel this very complex issue is Stanlib Chief Economist, Mr. Kevin Lings. Kevin, welcome back to the State of the Nation.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for inviting.
You didn't mind my speech at the start.
It sounded exactly right.
Yeah, it is a thing that can drive me mad when people sort of think that the economy is like a minor thing, but we'll do politics. And you want to say it's all linked.
Yeah.
Right? Unless we go and somebody attacks us, different story. That's a minute period in time. The rest of the time, we sit here trying to make a better life for South Africans, which means putting money in their pocket, food on the table, aspirations and dreams. Right?
That's right, yeah. So I think we lose that focus. And if you distill that down into what should be the main goal, in my mind, it's employment, because employment is the start of all of those achievements, right? Very difficult for somebody to prosper when they don't have a job. So if you made your most important goal, there are many goals, but let's say you made the pinnacle that you want to create jobs, then a lot of things would flow from that naturally. Once somebody's employed, they can take care of their retirement better, they can take care of their medical bills a bit better, they can feed themselves, they can use their own transport. Many things flow from it. So in my mind, what you want to do is create an environment in which that can happen. What is the best environment you can put together that will allow for job creation from the private sector, right? So if the private sector looks around and sees this is really great, I'm encouraged by what's going on, I'm going to build a factory, I'm going to start a business, I'm going to expand my operation, I'm going to employ people, then you are naturally providing an uplift to a huge part of the economy.
Now, there are many people that would be watching us and saying, well, the government can create jobs. Right? Now, please explain to people, because I've heard it too many times out of this ugly mouth, what the limitation is on government creating those jobs.
So there are many limitations, unfortunately. The first problem is government doesn't know what jobs to create, right? So let's say they created jobs within their own organization, within their own departments. You've got immediately a problem of who's going to pay for all of that. Yeah. And obviously, the people that are employed do pay taxes, but that's hopelessly too little to keep the system going. So you need private sector in order to function, in order to collect taxes, in order to make the government system viable. So if you said, okay, government's going to direct where these jobs are going to be created in the private sector, government has no idea. They may think they have an idea, but in truth, if we look in the past where governments have tried that, it's been a massive failure. So you've got to leave it up to the private sector to say, where's the best place to create a job? What is the best businesses? Businesses will start up and fail. That's a natural process. Don't worry about it. the success stories will emerge and they will be able to flourish. And so the market will determine where the opportunities are. And that's what business is good at. That's what entrepreneurs are good at. They're good at finding that opportunity. Government is useless at finding entrepreneurial opportunities. Government is useless at running a business.
Yes.
Now, if you look at South Africa, where government has a lot of businesses, right? And historically, that was always the case. And the current government has a huge number of businesses, and most of them, if not all of them, are absolute failures, requiring constant flow of capital from the center, requiring constant bailouts, having very difficult credit ratings, struggling to raise finance, struggling to operate productively. So government, through their actions, demonstrate they don't know how to run a business, in which case, don't try it. Step away from that, allow the entrepreneur to do that. Entrepreneurs will emerge, some will be success, some will fail, and ultimately you'll have a flourishing economy.
Yeah, government trying to solve the problem of unemployment or to run businesses is, to quote Winston Churchill, a bit like standing in the bucket and trying to pull yourself up by the handle, right? It just doesn't happen.
Exactly. So it's not like government doesn't have a role to play.
Yes.
Government has a role to play in creating what we call an enabling environment. Create the system, the set of rules, the set of regulations, the rule of law, property rights, all of those are critical. Create that environment and then say to the private sector, here's the playing field, here's the rules. Are you happy with that? Now go and create something, go and add jobs, go and expand, go and export, go and produce. And the private sector will do that. We know that from all of the successful countries around the world. And we know that in South Africa where we've had success. And there are private sector entities in South Africa that have been phenomenally successful despite the challenges. So we've demonstrated as a country our ability to be successful. What we don't have right now is that enabling environment to allow for true success.
Yeah, and once again, a lot of people will point to China, for example. What has the Chinese government done right? Have they run all of those businesses that we see where items flow out of China?
So if you look at Chinese government, they owned at one stage all of the businesses, very much a communist environment, central controlled, and incredible poverty, incredible low standard of living.
And famine,
absolutely.
Let's say, which is the ultimate manifestation of government failure, when people are literally dying of starvation.
So China was able to demonstrate that the central control didn't work. So what they then realized, well, we've got to deregulate. We've got to allow the private sector in. And once they realized that, and they allowed the private sector to invest, and get foreign investment in, then China becomes the success story. And I would argue right now, if I look at China's difficulty in sustaining that growth path, a lot of it relates to the fact that they don't want to relinquish full control. They want to remain as the Communist Party in charge with central control. They've relinquished a lot of options and allowed private sector in, but they're only willing to go so far. And if you look at what's stifling them now, is their desire to hold on to that center and not relinquish full control, and ultimately it may be their undermining of their economic success. So if I look at the most successful countries in the world, exclude the US, the most successful countries in the world have been the countries that have deregulated, created a good environment for business to operate, and allowed business to get on and do the things they do.
And the poster child for that is probably Southeast Asia, which has got that balance right.
Yes.
Of free enterprise and the government sitting there on the sideline. In fact, what China demonstrates very often is how bad the government is at allocating resources, as we call it in the economy. Why? They're always trying to think what people are going to do. They therefore end up building cities that nobody lives in, high-rise blocks that nobody lives in, but where people actually need that accommodation, government hasn't done anything. Yeah. Which shows you just how bad the government is at responding or trying to predict an economy.
Yes, so that investment hasn't been especially efficient. So they've created phenomenal, you have to give them credit, the building of infrastructure in China has been a huge success story. But it's come with a significant amount of debt. And if you look at China today, they're more indebted than the United States. If you take their total debt as a ratio of their economy, they've taken on in absolute terms in the last 10 years more debt than the United States, and that takes some doing. And the reason why this is a problem is that you've overbuilt. You've created capacity that you didn't need. You built railway lines, etc. you didn't need. You didn't worry about the cost of it. What you worried about was, let's just build this stuff and let's create a boom. And so you bought, essentially using debt, you bought an economic boom. Great at the time. Now you've got to sustain that. The problem is you can't keep building railways that go nowhere or towns that nobody lives in, so because you've got too little money. So now you're over-indebted and you have to change your tact. And China's struggling to change. It's struggling to develop other parts of the economy that are not infrastructure related.
Now you mentioned the word debt, and of course there's going to be a whole lot of people that immediately will say, well, America's got this debt problem.
Yeah.
But what people don't quite understand about American debt is that an overwhelming proportion of their debt is to Americans themselves.
Yes.
So in a way, that's like you borrowing from your parents. On the balance sheet, you're sitting with a debt to your parents. In reality, they're not going to kick you out of your house at the end of the day.
Yes, so the US has become significantly more indebted in the last couple of decades, and obviously it's a potential concern for them. It's not right now a major stumbling block, but it could well become, so they have to be mindful of that. If you break down that debt, a lot of that debt has come about because of military operations, and there's no doubt their military budget has become enormous, and they've used debt to fund that. And then I think where they've been a bit guilty is that when they themselves have had a crisis, say the global financial market crisis, the dot-com, anything to do with the housing crisis, they've used the government to bail out institutions, which has been very expensive. And if we look at the post-COVID environment, the most recent crisis, they use government funds to stimulate the economy, and you pay a price for that. So it's not as if the US is squeaky clean in terms of the way they operate. They're obviously the most successful country in the world. They're highly productive. There are lots of things that they do incredibly right. But there are some things at the margin which they need to address. And it's not that they can simply keep on with the same process, because ultimately it will undermine them. They've got a massive advantage no other country in the world has, and that they've got this trust in the US dollar, and that they've got people who believe in the US economy that are nowhere near the US. They don't live there. They trust it. People will buy the dollar. The dollar's the reserve currency. And that allows them to do these types of things. Now, many countries, including obviously South Africa, we don't have that advantage. That's just the way the world is. So we can't embark on the same process, nor can China. China is not a reserve currency of the world. And so the rules are different. That's just the way the world has emerged.
Now, we can prove the trust in the US dollar that the South African president, when he does a dirty deal, doesn't put rands in his couch or Chinese yuan. He makes sure that he gets US dollars to put in his couch. So which shows you even dictators, people in countries like South Africa that talk against the dollar, want to steal dollars. They don't want to steal yuan or Russian rubles.
Exactly. So if you look around the world, more than 80% of all global savings is in dollars. And that's a bizarre thing. I once did a whole exercise to look at the Middle East, for example, to look at where they hold their funds, and the vast majority of their funds are held in US dollars, even though many of those individuals would be very outspoken in their criticism of the United States. And so if you look at China, China has a huge investment in the US government. It owns a significant portion of US government debt. That's all in dollars. That's essentially providing the US government with funding. The US government doesn't provide China with that level of funding. So why is it that China is willing to invest in US government debt? Because these things are considered the safest investments in the world, and there's a residual trust in that. Now, you can go too far you can damage that, right? You can take that trust in the dollar. You can take it for granted, and ultimately you can destroy it. So that's something the US has to be very mindful of. But they're not at that point yet. There still is this belief that the US dollar is the most important currency in the world.
Yeah, and when people need to understand what it is that the US do right, is they do two things right, as far as I can see. They allow for success.
Yes.
And they allow for failure.
Yes.
South Africa doesn't allow for success. The minute you're successful, people try and stop you in ways. We're always talking wealth tax. We're always talking this. We're always talking that. Take this away, means of production, bullshit like that, right? South Africa, but let's be clear, for as long as you and I have been alive, so in other words, predates this government, has been very, very afraid of success. Failure is another thing. In the US, they're quite not happy, but they will let businesses close down.
Yeah.
They won't bail out. This beautiful record of allowing failure worked until the bailouts. Bailouts is a big stain on the American economic model, isn't it?
Yes.
And hopefully we've seen the end of that. It would just be a good result.
So the choice to bail out is a very difficult choice because there's always kind of a political undertone to that choice. Now, the institutions the US government has bailed out have been mostly the banking system or the financial system. The problem is that if you allow that system to fail, the implications are way bigger than simply one bank or two banks going out of business, and you do genuinely run the risk that your economy disintegrates, the way in which it operates, the financial system ties everything together. So if you don't hold that up, it has the ability to deravel or unravel the entire economic system. So that's why there is a focus on bailing out, and our Reserve Bank has assisted various banks. And there's no doubt, let's take a bank in South Africa, First National Bank. Let's say it had a major problem. There's no doubt the Reserve Bank would step in and provide support for that, and it would be underpinned by the South African government, because you can't allow a major bank like that to fail. And so there is, and that's around the world, right? So banks are a special case.
Yeah.
You've got to be careful, though, if you extend that into a whole range of entities. And in South Africa, we bailed out, right? We bailed out the post office many times. It hasn't turned around. There are many institutions that are government-owned that we bailed out, and we haven't yielded a good result. So we're not being diligent about what we support and what we don't support.
Yeah. So let's look at 2025.
Yes.
Now, South Africa has had a bumpy period. We had a bumpy period that predates COVID. And then if the bumpy period was bumpy, it became absolutely disastrous because of COVID and the response.
Sure.
And it was only really towards the back end of 2023 that we started to see something kind of normalizing. And then we were into an election year, a lot of uncertainty. Election delivers that uncertainty. And now the government of national unity gets formed with, I suppose, from a market perspective, the best outcome, and a lot of hope, but not a lot of follow-through.
Yes.
So as we embark on a new year in 2025, do you see the government of national unity or the South African economy responding better than what we've seen in the past?
So unfortunately, no. I think it's going to be slow going. I need to put this in context. So when the GNU happened, in the aftermath of the GNU, there was a clear improvement in sentiment. You could see it in the rand strengthened. You could see it in the bond market. You could see it in the equity market. You could certainly see it in currency markets. And you could see it when you spoke to businesses and CEOs. And then you could see it in the business and consumer confidence index. So there was a clear improvement in sentiment and a hope or expectation. But it needed follow-through. It needed to be supported by further tangible evidence. South Africa's implementing a lot of the policies they've spoken about. And unfortunately, since the election at the end of May, we haven't done that. We've allowed the Pier 2 harbour deal to go south, so there's no Pier 2 harbour deal to revamp the harbour at Durban. We've got to pretty much start that again. We've had to wait for the Transnet network statement. That's taken longer than we thought. It's now out, but it's been significantly delayed. And we haven't been able to implement any other clear initiative that really captures people's imagination. Yes, we started to cut interest rates, and we did the two-pot withdrawal, which is a terrible way to boost your economy, but it's not enough. You can't drive this economy forward by simply cutting interest rates and allowing people to take long-term savings and go shopping. So we need something else, and we need something else that starts to develop the infrastructure story and that brings to life private-public partnerships. Now, yes, we've kept the lights on since March, and that's good, but look at this. The manufacturing sector, if you look at it relative to March, it's declined. Yet we've kept the lights on. So it's telling you that simply keeping the lights on is not enough. You've got to do way more than that. You've got to improve the harbour system, the rail system, the road system. People are worried about the water system. And so as we go at the start of this year, there's less enthusiasm. That sentiment benefit we had has dissipated, and we can see that now in the currency. And that's partly why the currency got to 19 Rand to the dollar, is there wasn't a follow-through. The medium-term budget lacked imagination. There was nothing in the medium-term budget that got people excited. So now you're sitting at the beginning of the year saying, could the State of the Nation address deliver something? Could the national budget in February deliver something? Maybe. But I think the reality is it's going to be a slow, hard slog from here. Maybe in 3 years' time, we're more optimistic because then we've got a bit more infrastructure. We've got proof statements. But putting out a speech, standing up and delivering a speech to the State of the Nation ain't going to do it anymore.
Yeah.
People are tired of the speeches in South Africa, the empty promises. What you need now, South Africa, is a deliverable. So to say, I was planning to do this, I said I would do it, I've done it, here it is. Proof statement. That would genuinely raise confidence, and what you want to do is draw the private sector back into the economy to say, I can see a prospect ahead. So I've spoken to a number of CEOs in the last couple of months, and I've said to them, are you more optimistic? And they've all uniformly said, yes, we're more optimistic. And I followed that question up with, so does that mean you're undertaking more investment? Are you expanding and employing? And quickly the answer was no. We're not going that far. We're more encouraged because of the government and national unity, but we're not willing to yet expand our business. We don't need to build extra capacity. That's where we are. Yes. So now the focus is back on government to say, can you deliver on these private-public partnerships? Can Transnet deliver? Can you improve the rail system, the water system, the education, all of these systems? Can you make any difference that then shows up for the business community that says, yes, there's a prosperous future ahead? Then the business will invest. We just don't have that at the moment.
Yeah, may I suggest that you got your question wrong when you're speaking to the CEOs. The question wasn't, are you more optimistic? The question is, are you more pessimistic? Right? And they would have said, no, we're not more pessimistic. Because it's just a framing issue, isn't it? Because the reality is that there's nothing really to be optimistic about. All you got to say is, I feel less pessimistic.
Yeah. So
the worst didn't happen, not the good thing happened.
So it's a bit like this. Imagine you're in a car going down the highway, and suddenly there's an accident waiting to happen, and you can see yourself in this accident. And by some miracle, you avoid the accident. Now you're driving on the highway, and you feel that relief, that sense of, oh, I avoided the accident. Does that mean you're optimistic? So what was the accident? The accident was if we'd partnered between the ANC and the EFF or the ANC and the MK, and we'd taken South Africa in a different policy direction entirely. And many people thought that would transpire, and so we avoided that. So there's a relief that we partnered with a set of policies by other parties that seem quite reasonable. And so you're feeling that sense of relief. That doesn't mean that you're about to go out and buy a new car or invest in a new factory or anything like that. You've just felt that you've avoided a worse outcome.
Yeah. You know, Kevin, I'm always struck by two countries that you know, there's many other examples, but two that stick to my mind because they're on opposite ends of the world, but yet there's a thing that sort of binds them, oddly enough, and that is Italy and South Korea. And the reason I pick on those two countries is because they both share two things. One has been economic prosperity, and the other has been political confusion, right? They've had bad politics in both countries. People think that South Korean politics has always been a mess. Italian politics has always been a mess, but yet the economy has prevailed because the people below have learned to disregard politicians. What worries me is that, what encourages me is that people are starting to disregard our politicians, which is a good thing.
Yes.
In other words, you're not expecting the politicians to solve the problem because you just realize they're not going to. And I put my own analysis on that being the reduction in the number of protests, meaning that I'm not going to attract their attention. Even if I do, they're not going to fix my problem. Therefore, I have to fix my own problem. Of course, we saw that sort of reinforced with the voting patterns. But I'm a little bit concerned that South Africa has reached an economic death spiral.
Yes.
Death spiral is when you get into a bad situation that you can't get out of, right? And that is that we've got a massive unemployment problem. And the way I see it, South Africa can only solve it in 4 ways. We are endowed with wonderful minerals, but we've made South Africa the most unfriendly place to mine in. Therefore, we're seeing mines close, not mines open, right? Nobody, I mean, we saw it with that failed bid of Billiton to buy Anglo, where they made conditional to that was that they had to get rid of their South African operation. So mining is off the table at the moment. Manufacture, we killed on purpose by, for the oddest reason, supporting Chinese imports when China's never done anything for South Africa. It's just a mad thing. So manufacture's off the table. Then we've got agriculture, where we are doing okay in. We're doing quite nicely. Can we ramp that up? Well, would you buy a farm if there's a question around property rights? So therefore, agriculture is kind of maybe not off the table, but certainly not growing. And the fourth one would be entrepreneurialism, which is a whole embedded system. And the government refuses to do that. They refuse to give property rights, intellectual property rights, certainty over policy, or support entrepreneurs in any way. What support do entrepreneurs need is government to get out of the way, and the government won't get out of the way. So I'm starting to worry that South Africa is in a permanent death spiral where we can go nowhere, a la Argentina in the 70s and 80s.
So it's a real concern that, right? So at the moment, we have got, strangely enough, bigger problems than that. So we've got what we would regard as binding constraints. Things that you have to resolve, otherwise there's no chance of the economy going forward. Those binding constraints are obvious. It's got to do with electricity, it's got to do with water, the railway system, the port system, the infrastructure. And so rightfully, the focus is on trying to alleviate those binding constraints. So think of an economy sitting there, treading water, waiting, and you're waiting for the key business infrastructure to improve so you can move forward. Let's say that we make progress on some of this infrastructure, more than we've got at the moment, a lot more. Then those constraints that you are flagging, those are still going to be there, right? And so you're going to have to do 2 things if you want South Africa to be prosperous. You're going to have to start to remove the binding constraints, which simply means building better infrastructure. And once you've removed or are in the process of removing those binding constraints, you have to do something about deregulating the system to allow the private sector to flourish. Whether that's entrepreneurship, whether that's got to do with small business, whether that's got to do with freeing up the mining sector, agriculture, anything like that, and hopefully all of them. That's still ahead of us. Right now, all of those problems that you flagged, that was being spoken about 10 years ago, but we've deteriorated to the point where we've introduced these binding constraints. So think of electricity. We kept keeping the lights on. But if we try to grow this economy at 3 or 4%, we don't have the power to do that. So it becomes a binding constraint. No matter what you do, no matter what policies you think you can come up with, you cannot grow that fast because ultimately you've got these overarching constraints. Hence the focus on trying to lift that. So I think the focus is right. The problem is that the implementation of trying to remove these binding constraints takes time. It's been delayed. It doesn't seem to have the right sense of urgency. And those issues you flagged, we're not dealing with them at any point. We're allowing those just to simmer in the background. So this is a significant overhang for South Africa. And you can see it in the results, right? Look at the economic growth. We're talking about 0.7% growth for last year. The population grows at 1.5%. Look at the year before, 0.7% growth. 2 years in a row of 0.7% growth. That means stagnation. The population has grown way more than that. That's not prosperous. And why has that come about? It's come about because you simply don't have enough electricity, enough port capacity, enough rail capacity. Those have become the binding constraints. That makes you feel that 3% GDP growth is a long way away. Is it impossible to achieve? No, it's not impossible to achieve, but you're going to have to change direction. You're going to have to become more urgent about implementing the infrastructure reforms. So you're going to have a palpable sense of urgency, the way we did with the Soccer World Cup, because there was a deadline. And the second is we're going to have to ask ourselves hard questions about how do you invigorate manufacturing? How do you get mining to expand? How do you get these sectors to engage more fully if you have the available infrastructure? I don't think we're doing that. We implemented a set of policies in 94, and we just kind of keep repeating those. And even though they haven't yielded a great result ultimately, we haven't changed the playbook. We're still following the similar type of policy approach, which is central control, which is government decides, which is government being highly regulatory across a lot of industries, and seeing that business is the adversary. And that's wrong. Business should be a true partner. Business has a huge amount to offer, and ultimately is the only thing that can deliver true economic success, which is employment.
And business pays for the party. Let's not forget that all taxes are generated by some guy who had an idea to start a business.
100%.
That gives the money to the government in the first place for them to do anything. Without business, you got nothing.
That's right.
Ask Zimbabwe. Ask Malawi.
Exactly. So for me, the negative right now, and I don't want to sound overly negative, but the negative right now is, let's say that we massively encourage business. Let's say that we had a change, a revisionist within government that said we are going to massively encourage business. Business has those binding constraints. Are you really going to invest without rail capacity, without the proper road capacity, without the electricity capacity? So you're stuck now. The focus is lift those binding constraints so that your growth rate goes above 1 or 2%. Then see if you can take it beyond that and go back to a 4 or 5% type economy. To get to a 4 or 5% growth economy, you need two things. Get the infrastructure working and deregulate industry in a way that encourages private sector investment.
Okay, so pretty dismal picture. And what South Africa does, I suppose it's human nature, we sit there and we go and buy a lottery ticket. Right, this is our way out. And a national lottery ticket is to say, don't worry, the solution's going to come from something external, right? And you do that. Now, many people think that a solution might come from another country, for example, right? A big brother who suddenly takes us under the wing and brings us up to speed. Let's talk about the international outlook, because the world is not a pretty place at the moment, right? So the biggest economy in the world, the US, is into the Trump second edition. What do you think that holds for the American economy and, by extension, the global economy, especially with respect to South Africa?
So I think Trump is all about trying to get the U.S. More prosperous for the benefit of the U.S. So he's much more of a nationalist, and he's about looking after the U.S. And clearly he sees international engagements as only useful if it ultimately benefits the United States. And I think that if you're sitting in the US, you may feel that's a good thing in the short term. Ultimately, I think it can be problematic because the US, while it's big, it's not an island. And so it does need the rest of the world for itself to be prosperous. So there's a risk with a Trump policy that you alienate the rest of the world to your own detriment. But in the short term, yes, it's about protectionism. It's about trying to encourage local industry. It's about trying to deregulate, make it easier to to extract oil, make it easier to do banking, and many businesses are encouraged by that. So you're probably likely to see a fairly solid growth performance out of the US. You're probably likely to see muted interest rate cuts from here because the Federal Reserve will worry about what this policy means for inflation, and inflation's taking its time coming down. So you're not going to see a massive interest rate stimulus, but you're going to see more stimulus from a regulatory point of view, making it easier to do business, making it easier for mergers and acquisition, making it easier to extract oil, those sorts of things. So I think the US will be in decent shape. How are they going to implement tariffs, and does that start a global trade war, an effective where everybody around the world is now being opportunistic on how they implement tariffs, and that can become detrimental. We've seen over decades that if the world is much more integrated, the world is much more prosperous. That global trade is so big, so important, that if global trade is flourishing, then the world is flourishing. And it just worries me that we're going into an era where you're going to get blocs trading more actively with themselves, excluding other countries, and that will tend to stifle growth a little bit. And so you're going to have to be very selective if it comes to investments or whatever. Where do you think these opportunities are? Who's winning out? Who's prospering? And I think ultimately nobody benefits, because I think ultimately going it alone for any of the major economies is not a success story.
Yeah.
If you're South Africa, though, South Africa and many other countries have tried to play this middle-of-the-road game where you are trying to effectively be neutral. You're saying you're being neutral. In other words, you don't want to feel like you're part of the US system, but you don't want to feel like you're necessarily part of the China and Russia system. And so outwardly, you're saying that you want to have a neutral approach and you'll do business with everybody. The truth of South Africa, though, is that we have become, in terms of our actions, much more aligned to China and the BRICS and to Russia, etc. And so that's the path that we've chosen. And we can see why, because of exports of mining products, etc., inclusion in the BRICS, etc. Is that a wise thing? I would say no. If South Africa is going to play international politics, but do it by genuinely being neutral, by not picking sides, that would be, I think, a better outcome. We are tending to pick sides. Tending to pick sides when you still need the United States is not a great prospect, because at some point the US may decide, look, we're not going to give South Africa preferential trade access. Why are we trying to assist? And they could cut that off, and that would be negative. So this is a risky game for South Africa to, in this environment, be seen to be much more purposely aligned to Russia and to China. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily a prosperous link. It had its reason, and it did benefit us at some time in terms of commodities. But is it a sensible thing to do right now? And I would like to see the South African government not de-link itself from BRICS, etc., but make it clearer that we're much more of a neutral player in all of this, and look for opportunities wherever we can find them. I think it's going to be tough going for smaller open economies in this environment. In a global trade arena, it's going to be tough. South Africa is going to have to rely much more on domestic activity than on international activity. I think it's going to be a time where many countries are going to turn inward and say, what can we do to help ourselves? And right now, there's lots we can be doing to help ourselves, and we don't need the rest of the world to build electricity, to build railways. So that to me would be the signal. The signal is turn inward. Don't exclude your foreign partners, but turn inward in terms of your primary initiatives. Get your infrastructure going, get it built, and start to, in that same time, demonstrate that you're open for business. Yeah. Whether it's local or international, you're genuinely open for business. What I don't understand, and I've never understood, is that if you do that, let's say you went that route, you would undoubtedly have more fixed investment. You would undoubtedly have more employment. You would undoubtedly collect more tax revenue. And you as a government would undoubtedly be more prosperous. Here's the crazy thing about South Africa. The ANC had its best voter support in the same year that the business confidence in South Africa was at the highest ever recorded. And that's not a coincidence. If you make business happy, you collect more money, you create more jobs, and you as a political party, you flourish. So your political success would be so much more enhanced if the business sector was confident in investing and creating jobs, because you can tell your electorate that you created those jobs. You created the environment in which those jobs could be built. And therefore you get the political capital as a result.
Yeah.
If you are the ANC and you're worried about losing power, your best course of action, make the private sector confident, get them to invest, get them to employ. They'll give you tax money, and the employment will give you votes.
Yeah. Like you said, their best ever electoral performance was when business confidence was at its highest. Also in the years 2002 to 2007, we added 500,000 jobs a year. There's a story that does the rounds that it was jobless growth. That's absolute lie. The fact of the matter is South Africa was adding 500,000 jobs a year at the time. And boy, what we would do for just half of those jobs. Let's talk about China quickly, because there's a lot of people that say, don't worry, China's on its way. Now, firstly, what do you say to the China hopefuls?
So China, I think you've got to give China credit for the transition from being a very poor, low-income economy. Today, they're an upper-middle-income economy. That takes a remarkable amount of effort. And so China is a major success turnaround story, right? But when you've established yourself as an industrial center, and China's done that, they're the manufacturing hub of the world, and you become more prosperous, your income grows. Eventually, your income, your salaries are too high in order for you to remain competitive. We saw that with Japan, we saw that with the United States. So now China is not as competitive as they used to be, and that road they chose on how to grow their economy, infrastructure and manufacturing, it served them well, but it's no longer the panacea for future growth. It's no longer the absolute focus. So China has to find a way to transition away from being an industrial hub and an infrastructure story into a service economy. The service economy is all kinds of things, right? Banking, but also entertainment, got a lot to do with tourism. And the US has done that remarkably well and flourished as a consequence of that. China's going to have to face the same challenge. The problem with following a services economy is that in order for that to work, including your IT sector, you've got to step further away from your control of the system. If you develop an infrastructure, you can develop that infrastructure by using state-owned enterprises. There's no loss of control if you're government. If you want to develop your industrial hub, you can do that and still retain a high degree of government control. But as soon as you start to allow private sector to flourish in finance, private sector to flourish in IT, in all kinds of other service economies, you systematically lose more of that central control as the Communist Party. And what I can see is that when it comes to things like IT, China doesn't want to do that. They want to retain that central control. And so their willingness to deregulate many service sectors is just not there. And I think ultimately that's what's going to stifle their growth. Their competitiveness on manufacturing is dwindling. Businesses are finding a home somewhere else that it is cheaper production. Their infrastructure is great, but they can't just keep developing more of that. And so China is going to find itself struggling to maintain the same growth rate and therefore maintain the same success story. That's their challenge. I haven't seen them respond effectively to their challenge. And it's a real risk because of the Communist Party's desire to remain fully in charge.
Yeah, because let's not forget that a Communist Party needs everybody's buy-in, right?
Yeah.
That's the difference between that and sort of an open political system. And also, if you're looking for an ally, a business partner, you should have complementary offerings. What do we have that's complementary with China? They want to make stuff. We want to buy stuff. We can't compete with them in manufacture. We can only give them resources that they can then turn into manufactured goods and give it back to us. But there's no complementary thing. There's not like you'd have with a developed economy that would put manufacture here.
Yes.
And nowhere is that better on show than in the vehicle market, where China's selling us cars now We're loving it. We're getting all these Chinese cars subsidized by Chinese taxpayers. But of course, all the car making plants that are in South Africa belong to countries that we are hostile to. And soon enough, they're going to close those plants, right? And we're going to then left with, much like we did with textiles, where we're just an importer of cars, we don't manufacture. I just want to close off by asking if you are seeing any break in the weather, as it were, with the African story, African economies that are responding, African economies that could potentially trade with South Africa, because, we keep on talking about other places, but we never talk about Africa.
So it remains a huge opportunity. It remains a potential. There's always been, and I think it's a really good thought, if you could integrate the African economies more effectively. By that I mean allow for border access or goods, people and money to flow across borders much more easily. Start with regional hubs and then expand that into a sub-Saharan African hub. Obviously, if you look at it, East Coast has done way better than the West Coast, and there is something of a trading hub and an easier flow of goods and services within the East Coast of Africa. And I think that remains the key sort of prospect outside of South Africa. But none of this has risen to the level that it's really made international news, where foreigners are lining up to invest and expand. And so I think what is a key limitation here is that all of the whole region needs much better infrastructure, particularly railroad and electricity. To build that infrastructure country by country is very expensive, and the capital base isn't really there to do it. The better way to do it is to build regional infrastructure, where a group of countries get together and decide, let's build a road network that links all of these countries, and we all get together and we all fund it and we all prosper as a result of that. That becomes viable. And once you do that, that open flow of goods and so on would prosper that region enormously. Now, that's been spoken about for decades. There's been this integration, a common currency. All of these ideas have been on the table. Nothing new there. But the ability to implement that and to make that real, is just taking forever.
Insecure Liberation Party leaders don't want to give over the controls. They also have their own patronage networks in every country. So it's not likely to happen, isn't it?
There are pockets of success that you can focus on, but nothing that really is standing out as being the next big thing. So a lot of my time is spent looking at, so if we're not that optimistic about China going forward, where's the next? And obviously that's India right now, and there are some good things happening in India, and their growth has been much better. But the key thing is, at what point do you unlock the value within sub-Saharan Africa? There's no doubt that there's enormous potential. And so we keep revisiting the region to say, is there genuine progress there? Is this their integration, deregulation? And it's not there. So our focus right now is India, and what is going on to make that the next big growth story. And I can see foreign investors, more foreign investors now have India on their radar. More foreign investors visit India. More foreign investors have Indian companies in their portfolio. So to me, that's where the focus is, rather than sub-Saharan Africa.
The problem, of course, and I sort of didn't mention India because India likes to trade with India.
Yeah, sure.
It's the most closed country and has been for centuries. Big country. What happens in India is done by Indians. They haven't really had an outward-looking moment. They never have. And that's why I didn't mention them. But, hey, you never know. Maybe they do open up. Well, Kevin Lings, has been wonderful to have a catch-up with you and this whole look at economies. One company that is doing well is Pace Car Rental, because they support the state of the nation, and we've given them a lot of business through this channel, through you, using Pace Car Rental, going onto their website, getting a discount using our code SONA, and please go and support them. And thank you so much for watching us, and hopefully you subscribe to the channel. We'll keep the good content coming. Kevin Lings, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for joining us today.